Hi, I'm Andrew McCrae. Welcome to our farm and ranch in northwest Missouri. My great-great-grandfather settled here in 1910, and I'm the fifth generation to grow crops and livestock here. As a farmer myself, I know the highs and lows of this life, the issues we confront every day, some new, some as old as farming itself. This show is a place to talk with farmers and others in the ag industry about topics that mean something to us, topics that can improve the present and future of our operations. This is Farming the Countryside. Josh Payne joins me. He farms near Concordia, Missouri. Josh, I am sure excited to get to visit with you again. We talked, I don't know how long ago it's been, but your story has inspired me in two ways as what I want to talk about today. One is perhaps existing farmers looking at maybe extra acres they have or underutilized acres and ways that they can make more money from those acres. And secondly, perhaps folks that don't have much acreage or kids that are wanting to come back into farming and how they can get started, because we often think we need a big outlay of land and equipment and so forth to do it. And that's not necessarily been the case with you. Let me begin by giving you just a minute to describe how you got into farming, because you grew up on a farm, but perhaps didn't think you'd be coming back into the operation, right?
Yeah, my dad was a banker, and so he always described it as, "Hey, there's not enough room financially for you to be on a farm, so go do something else." So I was going to go be a teacher. I taught for seven or 8 years in several different places in kind of Missouri area, and then after that, we wanted to move to a small town. My dad had passed away when I was in college, and so then what we ended up with was like we're here in this small town. My grandpa has the farm. I told him I would help just kind of on a part-time basis. And then, like farms go, you end up getting roped into all this stuff. So I ended up with zero farming background in the middle of a very conventional, mid-size at the time, 600-acre row crop operation.
So with 600 acres, you didn't have enough acreage to probably go full bore row crop and make lots of money to support you. So did you then quickly come to the idea that I've got to do something else if I want to be farming full time?
Well, no. So the nice thing is in our area, and my grandpa did a great job and has helped us out so many ways. He had land and equipment paid for. And so in our area, about 600 acres, if you have land and equipment paid for, you can make it fly. You can make it float. So we were okay for a little bit as long as we lived simply. The interesting thing is when my sister graduated college, went to be a teacher, she eventually became interested in like what happens to the farm. So the question was, well, what happens if my sister wants to be involved? At that point, that's when we were going to either have to, like my phrase for it is, we either have to get big or we're going to have to get a little weird.
So you got weird, is that right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the neighbors would say that. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, so then we started looking into different ways to make more money per acre as opposed to getting more acres. Because like in our area, if you have 1,000 acres, then you can make it work. So if my sister wanted to come back, we could pick up 1,000 acres, but that means we need more equipment, we need more land, and like we just get into that cycle. So we said, well, we met some people at the University of Missouri, and they said, well, you can think about chestnuts. And they're like, well, chestnuts at a wholesale level, they'll produce about 2,000 pounds per acre at $3 a pound wholesale. So then we're like, oh, well, that's $6,000 an acre. If we put 30 acres in here, that is enough for my grandpa and me and my sister to make a go at this, right? If we ever wanted to do that. The problem is we just had to wait 10 years for the first harvest. Um, so we just decided to kind of move in that direction. So instead of taking and getting more acres, we decided that we wanted to take these small pockets of our farm and really try to add value to it. So we were going to keep row cropping forever, indefinitely, and then add these little pockets in.
So you talk about those pockets. Was there any one certain place you began? Because pretty soon you had a conversation, I believe, with a banker about sheep. Is that right? And your sheep math came into this equation.
Yeah, well, so the first part of that was, well, we started and we planted a chestnut orchard and we alley cropped in between there. So we just grew corn and soy in our kind of regenerative way with our cover crops in between these chestnuts so that we could cash flow this while the orchard grows up, right? Now, in the middle of this, that's when I found out that my body doesn't get rid of toxins, and herbicides cause anaphylactic reactions in my throat. So at that point, we had to think really weird. And that's where sheep came in, because we had a chance to go with cattle or with sheep. And we basically chose sheep because sheep math is really good. If you can have 3 ewes per acre, at a very wholesale level, you end up with 4 lambs per acre. You sell a lamb for between 150 and 250, depending upon the season. So if you call that 200 because it's easy math, so then that's $800 per acre, and you're going to spend about $100 per acre. And that's significantly better profit-wise, even if you include $150 or $200 cash rent, than any sort of row crops that we could have done.
So you got over to the sheep pretty quickly then. You had the chestnuts growing, but was the sheep then the piece that was sustaining you, in a sense, day to day?
Yeah, so we moved from row crops, the main economic driver of the farm, to now, at the time and now, sheep were the main driver, right? And our kind of model is, if something works at a wholesale level, like sheep do, right? If something works at a wholesale level, then if we can take and direct market on top of that and double our value or triple our value in some situations, then that's how we can provide extra jobs also. So the sheep could do that. And then we started direct marketing lamb and beef at farmers markets in different ways. So just to add on top of that wholesale level.
Yeah, so you began doing that. And do you still go into Kansas City then and market direct, or how do you market that sheep and lamb and beef?
Oh, well, that's the messiness of life, right? So my grandpa now, he's 96, and he needs a lot of care. So we just decided that we couldn't actually dedicate the time to spending like a full day Saturday and all the time to direct market. So right now, direct marketing is on hold until my grandpa's life situation changes. That's just one of the hard parts of familial life.
Yeah, yeah. But can you still then market from the farm while you still don't go to the market itself in Kansas City?
Yep. Yep. So we do that. And then, so then what we've kind of done is we've differentiated in a different way instead of just wholesale. Well, now we sell breeding stock through a pretty famous livestock producer in Missouri. And so that takes that $200 level and adds it up to between 250 and 300. And then we sell breeding stock ourselves, and that goes 300 to 350. And then we also sell to a grocery store, to a couple meat purveyors. And that's around that 250 to 300 range too. So we're still doing the same idea, taking the wholesale level and adding value on top of that. It just looks a little different until my grandpa's life situation changes.
Remind me then, you had that 600 acres, but am I correct that you weren't using that entire 600 acres, but were renting some of the ground out because you didn't raise sheep on that many acres, right?
Yeah. So right now we run sheep on about 300 acres, and then we have another 300 acres, different places that are just not contiguous, not conducive to grazing, and really we just haven't had the time to get to them yet. So yeah, so actually our next project is to take one of those. We have a 110 acre plot. To take one of those and turn those into a wholesale pastured pork operation that we're actually really excited about.
So walk me through the pork piece, because this is new, but you believe 40 acres can support a person in this pork operation. Is that right?
Yeah. So again, like just broad math here, right? And this is all based upon, like, there's a couple wholesale pork operations that are selling largely to Whole Foods or places like California with the new Proposition 12 things, in which the consumers are starting to demand like not confinement raised pork. So that's some people still do that, and that's okay. We're saying, hey, there's a market there, so we'll take advantage of that. So we can contract a finished hog for really close. It's like 295, but so $300 a pig. We can buy a feeder pig at 100, and we can have full feed at 100, and then we can sell that thing on the hoof for 300. So then that's an extra $100 profit there per pig. And if we can finish 40 pigs per acre every month, that ends up being $4,000 a month times, of the profit times 12, and that's $48,000. That's not a bad job in this area, right? And then we're trying to do it with 80 pigs per month. Essentially, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take a a hoop house, and then we're going to grow grains in between tree rows because we got to have trees and everything, right? So we're going to plant these rows of trees that eventually will drop fruit, mulberries, persimmons, apples, chestnuts, thornless honey locusts, and eventually those will provide significant amounts of like feed for those pigs. But then we're going to grow grains in between based upon when those pigs are going to be in there. So we'll have milo, and we'll have those headed out milo. We'll have standing wheat, oats and corn kind of in shoulder seasons. And then we'll go through and we'll graze a strip in between the trees for a couple weeks, move them to the next one, and then turn around and replant that. We think that we can cut our feed costs close to like down to a quarter of that. And then if we're farrowing our own in these hoop buildings, you know, the cost of that's down to half. So now you're talking about close to profiting 150-ish per pig, 175, depending upon the feed cost. And that ends up being really good math.
Some people listening to this will say, okay, the math on this sounds great, but how do you come up with enough labor or time to be able to do that? So talk through that piece.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked that question because that's the driver. And like I think that's kind of how I think about things differently. You know, for my grandpa, he spent his entire career saying, how do I do all this myself? How do I go from like needing other people and needing my neighbors to having the equipment to be able to do this and this and this and make this a whole one-man show? Like this was a one-man show for 600 acres for a really long time, and he could do it. He didn't need to even really hire people in harvest to do it. There's people who have one-man shows for 1,000 acres or for 2,000 acres, and they just replace people with equipment. What we're saying is like the driver of this hog thing is actually my brother-in-law. He works in Kansas City and he wants to be able to not drive to Kansas City. So we're like, hey, is there a way that we can make enough money on acres of land that we have that he doesn't have to drive to Kansas City? So instead of Independence being my driver, our driver on our farm is actually people. So I would love to replace, like if the labor's there and the people are there, I'd love to replace equipment or I'd love to replace that with people. And that's kind of, I think that's kind of the ethos of what we're trying to get at. I talk to so many farmers who want their kids to come back. I'm like, well, if you want your kids to come back, you got to have something meaningful for them to do that they know how to do and that they can make actual money at. I mean, if you were to take 1,000-acre farmer and you were to take 40 or 1,000-acre farm and 40 of that, and you take it out of row crops or modify it, and you say, hey, look, this is your full-time job. All you're going to do is do pigs, but you're going to help me in harvest and planting when I really need your help, right? Now, all of a sudden, this 1,000-acre farmer is a 960-acre farmer. They have a 40-acre pig operation that their son or daughter runs, and now there's two people there.
And you would probably tell me the 40 acres could make as much profit as the 960 acres doing some of the things you're doing. Would that be right?
Yeah, I mean, at commodity prices today, absolutely, and probably more. So the reality of that is you'll probably go from 40 to 80 to 120. That's just the way it kind of goes. The problem is you just need more people. And I think that, like, for me, that's just good news. Like, that's good news for a small town, right? If all of a sudden now we go from 2 full-time jobs on our farm to 3, and then 3 to 4, like we just had a guy come and ask us about a full-time job, and we're like, hey, we have a real possibility for that in this hog operation. That's good news for a town of 2,000, 4 jobs, or if we get up to 6 or 8 or 10, you know.
We'll talk about that because I think in farm country, we think about, hey, we've got a labor shortage. We can't find enough people that want to do this. But your model is based on, I want more people to be farming. So how do you do that? Is it because the math works and I can make this lucrative enough that somebody says, and hopefully they enjoy the job. I don't want to make it sound like it's a horrible job. I mean, you've got to like working outdoors, you do, but you don't seem to have the labor problem. Am I wrong on that?
Well, I mean, I think, okay, so like you compare my grandpa to us. My grandpa, in his mind, you got to pay everybody like $6 an hour because that's what they should make. I'm like, Grandpa, like you're going to take a $500,000 combine. You're going to pay somebody $6 an hour to drive that thing. Like that's a really bad life decision. But yeah, it's like if you can give people like one, I think is the economic stuff. It's just like teachers. The teachers in our town make $30,000, like with a master's degree. So it's like, so if you can economically incentivize and provide something meaningful that they take ownership. I think those are two really big things. Not everybody wants to do that, but like this guy who just can't, he moved from Arizona, he moved from, like, away from his sales job, and he wants to work outside. Not everybody wants to do that, but there's enough people out there who find meaning in not sitting behind a desk. So if we can make that economically work, then I don't, I say that, but we don't seem to have that problem right now.
What would be your case for larger farmers that perhaps are looking to make a little extra income? Is it looking for those unused acres? And then is it doing things like chestnuts? Or what have you found if you were talking to a larger farmer who says, well, I've already got the acreage, so I'm not looking to completely change my operation, but I am looking for a way that I can make a little extra income and maybe involve somebody else in my family or somebody in the community to share in some of that profit?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think about pockets of land. Um, like our answer in our area is if something's really wet, well, you just tile it, right? But you could also plant pecans there and make $7,000 or $8,000 an acre in our area. That's not everywhere. So one, it's like look for pockets that maybe don't produce super well, and then figure out what's suited for that. Like that's a really good starting point. Another thing that I like to think about is like, what kind of equipment do I have that I can use and repurpose and not have to like just go into a lot of debt to buy new equipment. And then the other end is just like look and like get to know people, like universities in your area, different farmers in your area, and kind of see what they're doing. It's like people have probably figured out in your area how you can add value in small areas. And I think then there's those, and then the other part of that is you got to be willing to let the coffee shop talk bad about you, I guess, or tell stories about you.
And I know that you've said that even your grandfather at first was talking about this too, right?
He still tells me every week. He's like, they'll still sell bulldozers in 30 years. You can always push those trees out. So, but yeah, it's like yeah, but what I've found is like if you get into it and start into it, people find it less weird. And people are now genuinely curious. I've had several conversations with people like in my town, and people saying, hey, how do I think ahead for my next generation? Because that's the other thing. Like if you want the next generation to come back, you got to think 10 years down the road or 15 years down the road. And that's really hard if you're cash strapped in a hard financial situation. So those are like that's the reality of that.
Josh, I wanted to ask you about how we measure, I'll say, success in farming. And I think for a lot of us, it's always been, well, how many acres do you farm? And we measure the success by how many acres are we covering, or maybe it's how many head of livestock we have. The reality is we all got to make a living. And I know that we're not here to say, oh, well, look how much money I made. But your operation makes me think that, hey, we need to look at the bottom line. And if I can make cash off of 100 acres or 200 acres and do that just as well as 5,000, is it just a mindset shift in young people in agriculture to think about what is success in agriculture and farming?
Oh man, that is a really good question, right? Because it's not just how many acres; it's also like what's my bushels per acre. It doesn't matter if I'm profitable. If I just grew 280 bushels of corn, it didn't matter what I spent on that. It's like we don't talk. I think part of that's just private. Privacy. Nobody really wants to like the money conversation is always really hard, and just to talk about. But again, like I can't help but think that like for something to really change in agriculture around this issue, I think it's got to be oriented around something like people or like community. Like people care deeply about the small towns that they live in. Um, and it's like if so like my example is this from a guy named Wendell Berry. So he always talks about the environmental issues. And he's like, yeah, it's like environment it's important. Climate change is important, but the reality is like that's a very divisive topic. When you start talking about health of small towns, small stuff like what we're trying to do on our farm that makes more, that adds jobs, is actually way better like for the climate than any sort of global climate initiative that we can do. It kind of starts right here in these small areas. So like changing that big issue is really important. It just does come down to it comes down to landowners being willing to think differently about those acres, and I think a part of that, like I just always like to say, is like that, man, there is hope. Oh, and here the other thing is, like, think about a 70-year-old who your 35-year-old kid or your 40-year-old kid is now moved off. They went to college. They now have a job. Like, what hope do you have to put something in for 10 years down the future for your kid to farm? Like, really, the only hope that a lot of people have is that then, okay, their kids will inherit so that they can, like, get cash rent from somebody at some point, right? But again, like, I don't think that has to be the reality. And it may just involve thinking bigger about who family is. I've got a friend in Kansas. His name's Greg Christensen, and like he really kind of helped me think through this idea. Like, he has a big sheep operation, a big cattle operation, a big row crop operation, and his kids aren't going to farm it. They're doing their own thing. He's like, I'll find someone else, and that's okay.
Some people listening to this will say, man, how did you learn all of this so fast? Was there a trial and error? Because you've rattled off several things, pecans and chestnuts and hogs and sheep, and you've got all this going on. To me, you ramped up pretty quickly. How do people learn and get up to speed so they can do it?
That's a great question. Um, I mean, the good thing is there's resources. I haven't invented anything. Like, all I've done is taken what other people do really well and just, like, stuck it here. So, like, the learning curve, it's there, and you have to be okay, like, with some iterations and with some failures, and that's kind of a mindset thing as well too. But it's like, there's, like, I'm not reinventing this at all. There's people who have done this for 20 years and 40 years and 100 years. Like, our pig operation is literally a combination of the Rodale Institute's pastured pork stuff, a paper that we found from the NRS or whatever the whatever the government environmental thing was in, like, 1915 about grazing headed out pigs, and J. Russell Smith's tree crops. So it's this weird combination of three things that have been established for 120 years. And it's just, it's like, it's once I find it's the willingness to nose in. It's kind of like, I talked to my grandpa about that. Like, sometimes when you're looking at the corn rows with your combine, you're trying to figure out, where do I go in, because you can't see the point row or whatever. So it's like, sometimes you just got to nose in, and you're going to be off row, and you just back up and you do it again. So
Yeah. So you talked about what's ahead for the future with the pork side, but what else is on your mind? Because you're always looking at these opportunities for the acres that you have there.
yeah, I mean, right now, what fascinates my mind is the potential for trees in all these landscapes. And if I can go into my pasture, we just found a really cool way from a guy named Austin Unruh with Trees for Grazers and a lady named Wynn Miller to go in. We can plant trees and, like, disperse trees, like a 35 by 35 spacing, and protect those from cattle and sheep grazing by running a poly wire over the top of it and wrapping these little tubes with a poly wire hot wire. So we can literally go in and put trees however we want to in a pasture and have them protected with almost no maintenance. And it doesn't affect livestock flow, water access, any of those things. So it's like, man, if I can go in and put trees in, and I put the right mixture of trees, I put like 30% really fast growing trees, and I get really good shade quickly within like 2 years, and then layer those with longer stuff. For example, chestnuts are really high in starch, and sheep love to eat those things laying on the ground, and cattle just will go and eat those things up off the ground, and pigs eat it too. So, but if I can combine winter stockpile pasture with chestnuts laying on the ground, it's like I have corn laying on the ground with hay. And if I do this right now, 10 years from now in these pastures, I can have the ability to finish about 100 cows, or sorry, 200 steers on 100 acres for 3 months for almost no cost. Like, so how can I look ahead in the future to create those situations, in which 10 years from now I don't have to pay stuff, and when I'm getting to be 50 and 60, I can be a little bit lazier and not do some of these hard things.
Josh, I always learn so much from you, and it gets my mind to thinking as well. For folks that want to connect, is there a good way that they can find what you're doing? I know that you have a website, right?
Yeah, so like around the livestock area, we go under rustedplowshare.com. For tree planting stuff, we're starting to offer the service in our area. We have the equipment, we have the GPS, we can do it pretty easily, and we can help people get started on trees. So we can plant a tree for somebody, if it, a bare root tree for about $5 a tree, and that's planted, watered, and wood chipped. So that's a pretty easy way to get something going. So that's our business there is called stacked agroforestry. The idea is, how do we help people stack, like take their pastures or take their crop fields and stack enterprises on top of each other so that they can be more profitable.
Josh, there's so much more I can ask you, but we'll have to save it for another time. But sure, good conversation, and appreciate you taking time to visit.
All right, thank you.